So, like I said, you either play in a big market, you find the money to buy players, you either try to develop players somehow and hope they stick around long enough, like the Spurs did with Duncan and Parker and Ginobili, or the Cavs did with LeBron and, well, Kyrie to an extent, except then Kyrie left for a big market, hence this argument. Um, or you fail. Those are the only alternatives. And so teams that don't play in a desirable market and have lost for years are never going to regain that. They're never going to be able to compete. I mean, they might make the playoffs a few years, maybe fill up 3/4 of their venue if when we get back to normal and they're allowed to have fans in and they make the playoffs one year, maybe, perhaps. But I mean, aside from the Bucks, and the Bucks haven't won a championship, but aside from the Bucks, what other small market teams are good right now? The Jazz, kind of. I mean, well, the Jazz, I'm not saying the Jazz are a bad team. But you take a look at the main contending teams, the teams that have been projected to win the finals. They're the Clippers, the Lakers, the Sixers, the Nets. Los Angeles, Philadelphia, New York. Big markets. Like I said, I'm removing myself as a Sixers fan here. The Sixers, though, did build up their team the right way. They didn't make that many trades. I mean, 2019, they didn't really build a super team by bringing in Jimmy Butler and Tobias Harris. They still had JJ Redick out there who couldn't play defense to save his life. So they were by no means a super team like the Brooklyn Nets. But the problem with the NBA is that they allow these super teams to form and then people lose interest as a result. And this is, like I said, not just the case for the NBA. This is sports as a whole that don't have a hard salary cap. People are obviously losing interest in teams that stink. I mean, like, people aren't showing up to games. If you went anywhere near the Wells Fargo Center when the Sixers stunk, and I know the Sixers weren't a small market team, but back when they stunk, they couldn't fill that arena up to save their lives. It was filled with fans of other teams. And so they were in a rebuild, and teams that constantly have to rebuild, because they don't have a lot of money and they rely on their success by growing and developing players, they wind up losing a good deal of the revenue because nobody wants to watch a losing team, which in turn leads to bandwagoning. So now fans are going to pay $150 for MLB TV, maybe a couple hundred for a jersey, or like $100, $150 for a jersey, but they won't be directly supporting the team they support by buying tickets. They won't be directly helping them generate revenue. They will be helping the league generate revenue and big market teams specifically generate revenue. But, if you live in, let's see, who is the worst small market team in the league right now? The Minnesota Timberwolves. There we go. If you live in Minnesota right now, you're probably not watching the Timberwolves. You're probably watching the Lakers, the Nets, probably not the Sixers, probably not the Jazz, but perhaps one of those teams. You're not cheering for the Minnesota Timberwolves right now if you live in Minnesota, with like a few exceptions. You're buying, and let's say that this is a normal year. Let's say that fans are allowed in full capacity at stadiums. Nobody is still going to Minnesota Timberwolves games unless they're playing the Nets or the Sixers or the Jazz or the Lakers or the Clippers or somebody that has, big name players and is on a path to be a championship contender. And so you're spending perhaps $300 total on a team, whereas you could be spending $500 on tickets for the home team for multiple games in a season. I can tell you firsthand, I spent more money for tickets and concessions and parking at Citizens Bank Park in 2019 as a Phillies fan than I ever did on merchandise and MLB TV as a Rays fan. back when I was a Rays fan. And so the conclusion is that big market teams are the only ones that still make a lot of money. And speeding up the game like the MLB is trying to do, or changing the way it's played, that won't do anything, because the problem is not the sport. The problem is that people don't want to watch their teams continuously lose, because they're deliberately continuously losing, because that's their only path to success, is by losing, getting a high draft pick, and then lucking out and hoping that that person winds up carrying their team to a championship. And that's especially true in the NBA when it's a very much player-heavy league, but also it's the case in the MLB where you have to develop hitting and pitching and coaching from the bottom up if you're a small market team in order to compete. And the Rays did that perfectly, but how many other teams, how many other small market teams have been able to do that successfully? And so could you imagine if the NBA or if the NHL had a luxury tax? Like the Kings, the Leafs, and the Bruins, they would pretty much own the league. Like the first line of the Leafs would be Draisaitl, Matthews, Eichel. Do you really think that's fair? And then Carolina, for example, or Florida, they would have a first line full of some other team's AHL guys. You know, current AHL guys. Because they'd be trading all these players over because they wouldn't have to worry about cap hit. They wouldn't have to worry about staying under the salary cap, because all they would do is just buy and sell players. They would just buy players and then ship off prospects, you know, to teams that needed prospects, because prospects are the only way to succeed.